The iron shackles had worn raw circles around Aiyana's wrists, but she kept her chin raised as Captain Morrison paraded her through Fort Gibson like a trophy. "Savage," he spat to the gathering soldiers. "Caught her trying to poison the water supply with her heathen herbs." The lie tasted bitter as smoke in the Oklahoma air, but Aiyana had learned that white men's truths bent like river reeds, always toward their convenience. She'd been gathering medicinal plants for her grandmother's fever, nothing more, but Morrison needed a scapegoat for the sickness spreading through his fort, and a lone Cherokee woman made an easy target. The chains bit deeper as Morrison jerked her forward, displaying her to the crowd like livestock at auction. $25 to any man brave enough to take this savage off the Army's hands, he announced. But keep her chained. Cherokee blood runs hot with violence. Aiyana's father had been a respected medicine man before the soldiers came. Her mother, daughter of a chief. But here, stripped of context and family, she was merely another problem to be sold and forgotten. The soldiers' hungry stares crawled over her like insects, and she forced herself to breathe steadily, drawing on the strength her grandmother had taught her to find in the spaces between heartbeats. From the back of the crowd, a tall rancher stepped forward. His clothes were work-worn leather and cotton, not the pressed uniforms of the fort, and his hat cast shadows that made his expression unreadable. "I'll take her," he said simply, pulling coins from his pocket without hesitation. "Samuel Garrett," Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of a problem solved. "Should have known you'd want another pair of hands for that ranch of yours. Just remember, keep those chains on. Can't trust their kind." Garrett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he only nodded and counted out the money. As Morrison unlocked her ankle chains but left the wrist shackles, Aiyana caught Garrett's eyes for the first time. They were gray as storm clouds, and something in their depths made her heart stutter, not fear, but something more dangerous. Hope. The ride to Garrett's ranch stretched 15 miles through rolling Oklahoma grassland. Aiyana sat stiffly in the wagon bed, wrists still bound, watching this stranger who'd bought her like cattle. He hadn't spoken since leaving the fort, but twice she'd caught him glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Samuel Garrett had lived alone on his 1,000-acre spread for 3 years, ever since his wife Martha died birthing their stillborn son. The ranch prospered under his careful hand, but the house echoed with absence, and he'd grown used to speaking only to his horses. He hadn't planned to buy a person today, had only gone to the fort for supplies. But watching Morrison parade that young woman around like a prize heifer had stirred something in him he'd thought buried with Martha. The Cherokee woman, Aiyana, he'd heard someone call her, sat with the dignity of a queen despite her circumstances. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, framing a face that was strong rather than pretty, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She couldn't be more than 22, but she carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty and survived it intact.
"Water," Garrett said finally, stopping the wagon beside a creek. He climbed down and approached her carefully, hands visible and empty. "You must be thirsty." Aiyana watched him warily as he knelt by the water, cupping it in his palms and bringing it to her lips. The kindness in the gesture caught her off guard. No white man had ever knelt before her, and certainly not to offer care. She drank gratefully, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "Thank you," she said in careful English. Her grandmother had insisted she learn the white man's tongue, knowing survival often depended on understanding one's enemies. "Those chains," Garrett said, studying the iron cuffs around her wrists. "They're too tight, cutting off your circulation." He reached for her hands, and Aiyana flinched instinctively. Garrett froze, his calloused fingers hovering inches from her skin. "I won't hurt you, but those need to come off before they do permanent damage." For a long moment they stayed frozen in that tableau, his hands extended in offer, hers trembling with the effort not to pull away. Finally she extended her arms toward him, wrists up, surrendering to this small act of trust. The metal had worn through her skin in places, leaving angry red welts that made Garrett's stomach clench. "Jesus," he breathed, examining the damage. "What kind of man does this to another person?" He pulled a set of lockpicks from his pocket, tools he'd learned to use as a boy on his father's ranch when cattle got tangled in wire. The shackles were Army issue, built for security rather than complexity, and within minutes they clicked open and fell away. Aiyana gasped as blood flowed back into her hands, the relief so intense that it brought tears to her eyes. She rubbed her wrists gently, marveling at the simple freedom to move them. "Better?" Garrett asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The kindness in his gray eyes was more dangerous than chains. It made her want to hope, and hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. As they continued toward his ranch, Aiyana found herself studying her buyer with growing curiosity. Samuel Garrett was perhaps 30, with the lean build of a man who worked his own land. His hands, when he'd freed her chains, had been gentle despite their obvious strength. But it was his stillness that intrigued her most, the way he moved through the world like a man who'd learned to be alone. The ranch house appeared as the sun began its descent, a sturdy wooden structure with a wide porch and flower boxes that had gone untended. Garrett stopped the wagon by the front steps and climbed down, then approached her side with the same careful movements he'd used at the creek. "I know you don't have reason to trust me, but I want you to know you're safe here. Whatever Morrison told you I intended, he was wrong." Aiyana studied his face, searching for the lies she'd learned to expect from white men. But his gray eyes held only sincerity, and something in her chest loosened slightly. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I haven't figured that out yet. I just knew I couldn't let Morrison sell you to someone who'd—" He trailed off, jaw working. "Someone who'd what?" "Someone who'd see you as less than human." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, carrying more anger than he realized he felt. Aiyana climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady after the long ride. Garrett reached out instinctively to steady her, then caught himself and stepped back, giving her space to find her balance.
The house was clean but sparse, with the particular emptiness of a place where someone lived but didn't truly inhabit. Garrett led her to the kitchen, where he pumped water into a basin and set out clean cloth. "For your wrists," he said, "and there's a room upstairs if you want to rest." "What happens tomorrow?" Aiyana asked. Garrett turned to look at her, and she saw uncertainty flicker across his features. "I suppose that depends on what you want to happen." The answer surprised her. In her experience, white men took what they wanted without asking permission. "I want to go home to my grandmother." "Where is home?" 2 days' ride north in the hills." She watched his face for the refusal she expected. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Then we'll get you there. But not tonight. It's too late to start, and you need rest." Aiyana stared at him. "You would let me go? Just like that?" "Lady, I bought you to keep you safe, not to keep you prisoner." Garrett's voice carried a hint of the pain that drove him to solitary living. "I've got no right to hold anyone against their will." Later that evening, as Aiyana sat in the kitchen, cleaning her wounded wrists, she found herself watching Garrett through the window as he tended his horses. He moved with economical grace, speaking softly to the animals, his face gentler than it had been during their tense exchanges. She'd expected demands, threats, the casual violence that seemed to follow white soldiers like shadows. Instead, she'd found consideration, careful boundaries, and something that looked almost like loneliness in his gray eyes. When he came back inside, she had coffee brewing, a peace offering of sorts. "You didn't have to do that," he said, surprised. "You didn't have to free my chains," she replied. They sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table, the coffee growing cold between them as night settled over the ranch. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable, more like the quiet understanding between people who'd both learned that words could be weapons. "Why did you buy me?" Aiyana asked. Garrett stared into his cup. "My wife died 3 years ago, childbirth. Before that, I thought I understood how the world worked. Good people prospered, bad people got what they deserved." He looked up at her. "Watching Morrison today, seeing the way those soldiers looked at you, I realized I couldn't just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it. So you saved me to ease your conscience?" "Maybe." His honesty surprised them both. "Or maybe I saved you because someone should have saved Martha and no one could." Aiyana felt something shift in her chest, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for whatever brought you to Morrison's attention." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, and when Garrett showed her to the spare room upstairs, he left the door unlocked and open. It was a small gesture, but it spoke louder than promises.
The next morning, Aiyana woke to the sound of Garrett moving quietly in the kitchen below. She dressed quickly and came downstairs to find him packing supplies into saddlebags. "For the journey to your grandmother's," he explained without looking up. 2 days' food and water, plus medical supplies for those wrists." Aiyana watched him work, noting the careful way he planned for her comfort. "You're really going to take me home?" "Said I would." He paused in his packing. "Unless you've changed your mind." Had she? During the long night, she'd found herself imagining what it would be like to stay, to help this broken man tend his garden, to hear him speak to her with the same gentleness he showed his horses. But that was foolishness, and she'd learned long ago that foolishness was a luxury her people couldn't afford. "No," she said firmly, "I want to go home." But as they rode north through the morning mist, Aiyana found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, wondering why the word home had begun to feel more complicated than it had just yesterday. The trail to the Cherokee settlement wound through hills thick with oak and hickory, country that Aiyana knew by heart. As they rode deeper into familiar territory, she began to relax, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of her childhood in these woods. Garrett found himself captivated by the way she spoke about her homeland, the reverence in her voice when she described the sacred sites, the practical knowledge she displayed about every plant and stream. This was a woman who belonged to the land in a way he was only beginning to understand. "There," she said as they crested a ridge. Below them smoke rose from cooking fires in a small village nestled beside a clear running stream. "My grandmother's house is the one with the yellow door." But as they descended toward the settlement, something felt wrong. The usual sounds of daily life, children playing, women calling to each other, the ring of axes and hammers were absent. The village was too quiet. Aiyana spurred her horse forward, dread growing in her chest. The yellow door of her grandmother's house hung open, and inside she found only emptiness. Scattered belongings, overturned furniture, signs of hasty departure. "They're gone," she whispered, sinking to her knees in the doorway. Garrett dismounted and approached carefully, his hand resting on his gun butt out of habit. "What happened here?" "Removal," an old voice said from behind them. They turned to see an ancient Cherokee man emerging from the tree line, leaning heavily on a walking stick. "Soldiers came 2 days ago. They said they had orders to move everyone to the territory in Kansas." Aiyana's face went white. "My grandmother, Elise, did she—" "She fought them," the old man said gently. "She was too old to start over again. They took her anyway, but she was very weak, child. The journey, I don't think she'll survive it." The sound that escaped Aiyana's throat was more animal than human, a keening cry of grief and rage that echoed off the surrounding hills. Garrett moved toward her instinctively, then stopped himself, recognizing that this pain was too vast for comfort from a stranger.
"Where did they take them?" he asked the old man. "West, toward the Kansas border. 3 days ago now. They'll be well ahead of us." "Us?" Aiyana looked up at Garrett through her tears. "If you want to find your grandmother, I'll help you," he said simply. "This isn't your fight." Garrett looked around at the empty houses, the scattered belongings, the evidence of lives torn apart by bureaucratic cruelty. "Maybe it should be." The old man studied Garrett with sharp eyes. "You're not Army." "Rancher. Samuel Garrett. And you would help our girl chase after the soldiers, even knowing they might not welcome your interference?" "Especially knowing it." Something passed between the two men, an understanding that transcended the cultural divide. The old man nodded slowly. "There's a shortcut through Devil's Canyon. Dangerous, but faster. If you ride hard, you might catch them before they reach the river crossing." Aiyana stood, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You don't owe me this, Samuel." The use of his first name sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Maybe I owe it to myself." They rode hard for 2 days, following the old man's directions through treacherous canyon paths that tested both their horses and their nerves. Aiyana led the way, her intimate knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable, while Garrett watched their back trail and managed supplies with the efficiency of a man used to making do. On the evening of the second day, they crested a hill and saw campfires in the valley below, a long line of them stretching beside a river. Even from a distance, they could see the organized chaos of a military escort, the neat rows of army tents, contrasting sharply with the scattered groups of Cherokee families huddled around smaller fires. "There." Aiyana breathed. "They're there." But even as relief flooded through her, she knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Getting into the camp, finding her grandmother, and getting out again without attracting the soldiers' attention would require more luck than she dared hope for. "We wait for full dark," Garrett said, studying the camp layout with tactical eyes. "Then we go in quiet, find your grandmother, and get out fast." "And if we're caught?" "Then we fight our way out." The matter-of-fact way he said it made something flutter in Aiyana's chest. This white rancher was willing to risk his life for an old Cherokee woman he'd never met, simply because it mattered to her. "Why?" she asked. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the distant fires. "Because someone should have fought for Martha when she needed it. Because Morrison was wrong to chain you like an animal. Because—" He looked at her finally, and she saw something raw and honest in his expression. "Because in the past 3 days, you've made me remember what it feels like to give a damn about something besides my own grief." The words hung between them like a bridge, dangerous to cross, impossible to ignore. Aiyana felt her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear of the mission ahead, but from the sudden recognition of what she'd been fighting since that first moment by the creek. She was falling in love with Samuel Garrett. The realization should have terrified her. He was white. She was Cherokee. He was a rancher with land and status, and she was a woman without even a home to return to now. But as she looked into his gray eyes, she saw not difference, but recognition. Two people who'd learned to build walls around their hearts, and who'd somehow found the courage to let each other in. "Samuel," she began, but he shook his head. "After," he said. "Whatever you were going to say, save it for after we find your grandmother." But they both knew that after might never come. As full darkness settled over the valley, they made their way down toward the camp, moving like shadows between the scattered trees. The Cherokee families were clustered together for warmth and comfort, while the soldiers maintained their perimeter with military precision. Aiyana led them through the maze of small camps, searching each group of faces for her grandmother's familiar features. They were almost to the far end of the line when she saw her, a frail figure huddled under a thin blanket, coughing wetly into her hands. "Elise," Aiyana whispered, crawling forward on her belly. Her grandmother looked up with cloudy eyes that slowly cleared as recognition dawned. "Aiyana. Child, how did you—" "Shh." Aiyana gathered the old woman into her arms, feeling how light she'd become, how fragile. "I've come to take you home." "There is no home anymore," her grandmother said sadly. "The soldiers, they burned the village after we left, said it was to prevent us from coming back." The news hit Aiyana like a physical blow. Everything, her childhood home, her father's medicine lodge, her mother's garden, gone, reduced to ash and memory. "Then we'll make a new home," she said fiercely, "somewhere safe." Behind them, Garrett kept watch, his hand on his gun as he scanned for approaching soldiers. But their luck couldn't hold forever, and just as Aiyana was helping her grandmother to her feet, a voice cut through the darkness. "Hey! What's going on over there?" A soldier was walking toward them, rifle in hand, suspicion written across his features. In seconds, he'd raise the alarm, and their escape would become a running battle they couldn't win. Garrett stepped out of the shadows, putting himself between the soldier and the two women. "Evening, Sergeant. Just checking on the prisoners. Captain Morrison sent me." The lie came smoothly, backed by the authority in his voice and the confident way he carried himself. The sergeant hesitated, clearly uncertain. "I don't know you," the sergeant said slowly. "Samuel Garrett, civilian contractor. I'm the one who bought the Cherokee woman from your captain yesterday." He gestured toward Aiyana. "Morrison wants me to evaluate the rest of them, see if any are worth salvaging before you march them to Kansas." It was a calculated risk, playing on the Army's casual racism and greed. The sergeant's expression cleared slightly. This made sense in the twisted logic of their world. "Well, make it quick," he said. "We move out before dawn." As the soldier turned away, Garrett breathed a silent prayer of thanks and gestured for the women to follow him. They moved slowly, supporting the grandmother between them, making their way toward the edge of camp with agonizing care. They were almost clear when the old woman stumbled, her cough turning violent enough to spray blood. The sound carried farther than they'd hoped, and suddenly there were shouts behind them, the stamp of running feet, the metallic click of weapons being readied. "Run!" Garrett said, lifting the grandmother into his arms. "I've got her!" They crashed through the underbrush toward their hidden horses, branches tearing at their clothes and skin. Behind them, the camp erupted into chaos as soldiers realized what was happening. Gunshots cracked through the night, muzzle flashes strobing between the trees. Garrett boosted the grandmother onto his horse, then swung up behind her while Aiyana mounted her own animal. "The canyon trail!" he shouted over the noise of pursuit. "They can't follow us there in the dark!" The next hour passed in a nightmare of desperate flight, racing along invisible paths, trusting their horses' instincts more than their own eyes. The old woman clinging weakly to Garrett's chest, while soldiers crashed through the forest behind them. But gradually the sounds of pursuit faded,
The canyon trail was too treacherous for men who didn't know the country, and eventually even the most determined soldiers had to give up the chase. They rode through the remainder of the night, not stopping until they'd put 20 miles between themselves and the river crossing. When they finally made camp in a hidden valley, the grandmother was unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. "She's dying," Aiyana said, kneeling beside her. "No!" Garrett's voice was fierce. "We didn't come this far to lose Ramau." But even as he spoke, they both knew the truth. The old woman's strength was failing, her body unable to recover from the trauma of forced removal and desperate flight. "Child," the grandmother whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "Come close." Aiyana leaned down, tears streaming silently down her face. "This man," her grandmother said, her gaze shifting to Garrett. "He has a good heart. I can see it in the way he looks at you." "Elise, don't!" "Listen to me." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd lived long and seen much. "The world is changing. Our people will survive, but we must adapt. Sometimes that means choosing love over tradition, hope over fear." She reached up with a trembling hand to touch Aiyana's cheek. "Your grandfather was half white, did you know that? I never told you because I was afraid you would think less of our family's blood, but love doesn't recognize the boundaries men draw on maps." The revelation stunned Aiyana into silence. "This one," the grandmother continued, smiling weakly at Garrett, "he would die for you. I see it in his eyes. And you love him, even though you're afraid to admit it. How did you—" "Because I was young once too, and I know how love looks when it's fighting against the world." The old woman's breathing grew more labored. "Don't make the same mistake I did, child. Don't let fear steal your happiness."
She closed her eyes then, and though she continued breathing for another hour, those were the last words she spoke. As dawn broke over the hidden valley, Aiyana's grandmother slipped away peacefully, leaving behind a granddaughter who suddenly understood that she was truly alone in the world, except for the white rancher who'd risked everything to help her. They buried the old woman on a hillside overlooking a stream, using stones to mark the grave and Aiyana's tears to consecrate the ground. Garrett said a few simple words, and Aiyana sang an old Cherokee song her grandmother had taught her, her voice breaking on the familiar notes. When it was done, they stood together in the morning light, two people who'd found each other in the midst of loss and violence, uncertain what came next. "What now?" Garrett asked gently. Aiyana looked at the fresh grave, then at the man who'd become her anchor in a world gone mad. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Don't let fear steal your happiness." "I don't know where I belong anymore," she said. "My village is gone. My grandmother is gone. I'm not sure I have a place in this world." "You have a place with me," Garrett said quietly, "if you want it." She turned to face him fully, this man who'd bought her freedom, respected her choices, fought beside her, and mourned her losses as if they were his own. "Samuel, I know it's complicated. I know there will be people who won't understand, won't accept us, but I also know that I'd rather face that with you than spend another day alone in that empty house. And if I can't be the wife you need, if I'm too damaged by all this—" He stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "Aiyana, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived Morrison's chains, a desperate chase, watching your grandmother die, and through it all, you never lost your dignity or your compassion. If anyone's damaged here, it's me." She leaned into his touch, feeling the last of her walls crumble. "My grandmother was right, wasn't she? I do love you." "And I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God help us both, but I do." When he kissed her,
It was with the desperate tenderness of two people who'd found something precious in the midst of devastation. The future stretched uncertain before them, full of challenges they could barely imagine. But as they held each other in the morning light beside her grandmother's grave, they knew they would face whatever came together. Later, as they rode back toward Garrett's ranch, Aiyana asked, "What will we tell people about us?" "The truth," he said simply. "That you're my wife, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Just like that. Just like that. 6 months later, the woman who had once been chained as a savage was teaching the rancher's wife, herself, how to tend a garden that bloomed with both European roses and native wildflowers. When neighbors came calling, some with acceptance, and some with barely concealed hostility, they found a couple who faced the world with quiet dignity and unshakable unity. Samuel Garrett had bought a woman's freedom for $25. What he'd received in return was worth far more than he could ever repay. A love that had transformed his empty house into a home, his solitary existence into a shared life, and his grief-numbed heart into something capable of joy again. And on quiet evenings, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the Oklahoma plains, Aiyana would sometimes touch the faint scars around her wrists and remember her grandmother's words. Love doesn't recognize the boundaries men draw on maps. In a world determined to keep them apart, they had chosen each other. And in that choosing, they had found not just love, but freedom. The kind that no chains could ever take away.